In 1954, Guatemala became a quiet battleground of global power. President Jacobo Árbenz was not preparing for war. But his land reforms directly threatened powerful American corporate and strategic interests. For the CIA, this was not a local political issue. It was a Cold War liability that had to be removed without direct military intervention. The decision was made quickly and silently. Jacobo Árbenz would not be confronted openly. His government would be collapsed from the inside. The operation was given a classified name: Operation PBSUCCESS. No public orders, no official fingerprints. If it failed, the United States would deny everything. Planning began in secure rooms far from Central America. Intelligence officers mapped Guatemala's political structure, military hierarchy, and social pressure points. Every officer loyal to Árbenz was identified. Every general with doubts was quietly studied. The goal was clear: fracture the system until it destroyed itself. CIA planners focused on one critical reality: Árbenz's greatest vulnerability was not the public, but the military. If the army lost confidence in him, the government would collapse without a full-scale invasion. That became the core objective. The covert network was built piece by piece. Agents were inserted under diplomatic cover. Safe houses were established. Communication lines were secured. Money was moved quietly to fund influence, loyalty shifts, and psychological pressure. Nothing was rushed. Every step was layered to avoid exposure. At the same time, psychological warfare was prepared. The operation would not rely on tanks, it would rely on fear. Guatemala would be made to believe that a powerful rebel force already existed, ready to overthrow the government. Whether that force was real or not was irrelevant. Perception was the weapon. Radio broadcasts were planned. False reports were drafted. Messages designed to undermine confidence in Árbenz were written and tested. The objective was to isolate him politically, militarily, and psychologically before any visible action began. By the end of this phase, everything was in position. The network was active. The targets were identified. The pressure points were ready. Operation PBSUCCESS had completed its first stage. The next phase would move from planning to action, where manipulation would turn into collapse, and silence would turn into chaos. With the groundwork complete, the operation shifted from preparation to pressure. Nothing exploded on day one. No troops crossed borders. Instead, Guatemala was slowly pushed into believing that its government was already losing control. The first weapon activated was radio warfare. A clandestine station began broadcasting under the name of a supposed rebel movement. The messages were precise, confident, and constant. Reports claimed that armed forces were advancing, cities were falling, and military units were defecting. None of it was true, but it sounded real enough to plant doubt. Guatemalan military officers started hearing the same reports from different sources: radio rumors, foreign whispers. The consistency was intentional. The goal was not to convince the public, it was to unsettle the army. Once doubt entered the chain of command, discipline began to weaken. At the same time, limited armed actions were staged. Small groups crossed borders, conducted brief engagements, then disappeared. These actions were never meant to win territory. They existed only to validate the radio reports. Each skirmish added credibility to the illusion of a growing rebellion. The assets inside Guatemala quietly amplified the chaos. Officers already uncertain about Árbenz were fed selective intelligence. Some were told that Washington had already decided the outcome. Others were warned that standing with the president would isolate them once the collapse began. No direct orders were given, only inevitability. Psychological pressure intensified. Leaflets appeared, false communiques circulated. Stories spread that senior commanders had secretly defected. Even officers loyal to Árbenz began questioning who could still be trusted. President Árbenz attempted to project control. Public statements were made. Emergency measures were discussed. But every response came too late. The damage was internal. The army was no longer confident that it could win, nor that it should try. Then came the most critical effect of the operation: hesitation. Units delayed orders. Commanders avoided responsibility. Decisions slowed at every level. In warfare, hesitation is collapse in progress. By now, the illusion had become stronger than reality. The rebel force appeared larger than it was. The threat felt closer than it actually was. And Árbenz's authority began to erode, because he was defeated, but because belief in his survival was fading. Operation PBSUCCESS had reached its turning point. The government still stood. The president was still in office, but the foundation beneath him was cracking. The next phase would determine whether Guatemala's leadership could recover, or whether the collapse would become irreversible. The illusion had done its work. By this stage, the real battlefield was no longer outside the capital, it was inside the Guatemalan military itself. Orders were still being issued, but obedience was no longer guaranteed. Every command now passed through doubt before action. President Jacobo Árbenz attempted to reassert control by mobilizing loyal units. On paper, the government still held numerical superiority. The army was intact. Weapons were available. Confidence, the most critical element, was gone. Commanders hesitated to move without assurances that others would support them. Those assurances never came. CIA's psychological pressure intensified at the exact moment the government tried to respond. Radio broadcasts escalated their tone, announcing imminent defections and the collapse of entire battalions. Again, most of it was fiction. But fiction repeated with authority becomes operational reality. Several senior officers began quietly withdrawing support, not openly, not dramatically. They delayed deployments, questioned intelligence, and avoided direct confrontation with the so-called rebel forces. This passive resistance was far more damaging than open rebellion. At the same time, limited air actions were introduced. Small aircraft flew over strategic locations, dropping leaflets and conducting symbolic strikes. The damage was minimal, but the message was devastating. It suggested air superiority, external backing, and escalation. For many officers, this confirmed their worst fear, that the United States was already fully committed to Árbenz's removal. The president now faced a critical choice: arm civilian militias and fight, or rely on an army that no longer believed in victory. Arming civilians risked total chaos and civil war. Trusting the army meant accepting a force that was quietly slipping away. Inside the cabinet, pressure mounted. Advisors warned that continued resistance would destroy the country. Others urged immediate resignation to prevent bloodshed. Árbenz's was no longer being advised on how to win, only on how to end it. The decisive moment came when the military command refused to guarantee loyalty. No coup was announced. No declaration was issued. But silence from the generals was louder than any statement. Without the army, the presidency was hollow. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Árbenz made his decision. He resigned not after defeat in battle, but after losing control of belief, momentum, and trust. The collapse was psychological, not military. Operation PBSUCCESS had achieved its core objective. A government fell without invasion. A president stepped down without a decisive battle. A nation changed direction without understanding how it happened. But the operation was not yet complete. The removal of Árbenz was only the first outcome. What followed would define Guatemala's future and the true cost of the mission. The final phase was about control, silence, and consequences. The moment Árbenz resigned, the streets of Guatemala City did not erupt in immediate celebration. Silence hung heavy, a mixture of relief and fear. The army had stepped back, the people were confused, and the nation's direction had suddenly shifted overnight. Yet, Operation PBSUCCESS was far from over. The covert mission now entered its final stage: consolidation and control. CIA operatives and local collaborators moved swiftly to install a new government. Officers loyal to the United States were positioned at key posts. Government departments were quietly taken over. Media outlets that had amplified the psychological campaign now broadcasted a narrative portraying Árbenz as a failed leader, incapable of maintaining order and national stability. Every channel, every headline, every radio message reinforced the new reality. In the capital and beyond, whispers spread. Citizens and soldiers alike realized that resistance was futile. Local networks of supporters and military officers who might have opposed the coup were neutralized through a combination of persuasion, threat, and selective reward. By the time the new leadership assumed power officially, the perception of inevitability had already taken hold. Meanwhile, the United States and the CIA publicly maintained distance. There were no overt invasions, no formal declarations. The mission's success relied entirely on the illusion that change was a natural consequence of internal failure, not external orchestration. The art of covert operation had reached its pinnacle, removing a government without firing a decisive shot. Long-term consequences unfolded rapidly. The Árbenz era ended, and a pro-U.S. administration took control. Land reforms were reversed, political dissent was suppressed, and Guatemala entered a new phase defined by dependence on American support and the presence of covert influence behind the scenes. Operation PBSUCCESS became a model for psychological warfare and regime change worldwide, a lesson in the power of deception, manipulation, and strategy. CIA officers reflected on the operation. The mission had been high-risk, precise, and entirely successful. No battlefield engagement, yet the objectives were met. Covert influence reshaped a nation, demonstrating that in espionage, the pen, the microphone, and the leaflet could be far more powerful than the bullet. For the citizens of Guatemala, the story was far more complicated. Fear, uncertainty, and political instability remained. The operation had achieved its goal, but at a profound human cost. Families displaced, political leaders imprisoned or exiled, and a nation forever altered by forces beyond their control. Operation PBSUCCESS ended not with a battle, but with silence, control, and a new order firmly in place. The covert mission had concluded, leaving lessons in strategy, psychological manipulation, and the fragile nature of political power for generations to come.